Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the first Istac-Iium Distinguished Scholar Lecture entitled Islam in Australia, History, Growth, Opportunities, and Challenges. I am Dr. Nurai Norman, your host and moderator for today. I would like to greet our Honorable Distinguished Scholar, Professor Dr. Muhammad Abdullah, the Acting Deputy Australian High Commissioner Malaysia, Ms. Claire Gatehouse, and Dean of International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, Istac-Iium, Professor Dr. Abdullah Birgoat, holder of Al-Ghazali in Epistemology Chair, Istac-Iium, Emeritus Professor Dr. Osman Bakar, Chief Executive Officer of Allied Coordinating Committee of Islamic NGOs AXIN, Tuan Haji IR Muhammad Jamaluddin Muhammad Shamsuddin, who is virtually with us today, Executive Director of Ikram Muslim Malaysia, Mr. Ustaz Magat Muhammad Amin, Magat Muhammad Noor, representatives from the Australian High Commission Malaysia, representatives from universities in Malaysia and Indonesia, international schools around the world. We have Abidin International School Malaysia, CIC Malaysia, Ulul Albab New Zealand, NGOs AXIN, Ikram Abid Mapim, Aman Malaysia Hidayah Center, respected deputy deans, head of administration, distinguished professors, doctors, Datin, the media team from Real Time and the Merdeka Times, participants, members of the organizing committee, ladies and gentlemen. This is the first Istac-Iium Distinguished Scholar Lecture, which is held in collaboration with the Australian High Commission Malaysia, who had kindly brought with them a prestigious professor from University of South Australia. So without further ado, I think we should start with inviting our, Acting Deputy Australian High Commissioner Malaysia, Ms. Claire Gatehouse, to deliver her welcoming speech.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Australian High Commission, I would like to begin by acknowledging and expressing our deep appreciation to Professor Abdullah Birgoat, Dean of International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization at the International Islamic University of Malaysia, and all his team for your willingness to partner with us on this lecture by Professor Muhammad Abdallah AM, who is one of Australia's foremost Islamic studies scholars and pioneers of Islamic education. Given Professor Abdullah's focus on Islamic education, a partnership with IIUM during his visit to Malaysia was an obvious choice, given IIUM's reputation as Malaysia's top Islamic university and as one of the world's best Islamic universities. The High Commission looks forward to more opportunities to partner with IIUM to expand academic collaboration and exchange, as well as to deepen the cultural and people-to-people ties between Australia and Malaysia. In 2020, the Governor-General of Australia appointed Professor Abdallah as a member of the Order of Australia to honour his outstanding achievements and services to Islamic education in Australia. This was no surprise, since Professor Abdallah has helped to establish Islamic studies units at Griffith University in Queensland, the National Centre of Excellence for Islamic Studies at the University of Melbourne, and at the University of South Australia, where he currently serves as the founding director of the Centre for Islamic Thought and Education. Islam has an important and growing place in Australia's diverse social fabric. In Australia's 2021 census, 3.2% of the population identified as Muslim. This makes Islam the second largest religion in Australia. There are few people better qualified to speak about the topics of contemporary Islam in Australia and the state of play on Islamic education. I look forward to hearing Professor Abdullah's insights and hope they provide a deeper understanding of modern Australia. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for the welcoming speech. Before that, I forgot to actually bless this first distinguished lecture with Tilawa al-Quran from Brother Muhammad Jain al-Abidin, former Imam of Shah's Mosque, IIUM, and also a PhD candidate of Istac-Iium, please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. آمن الرسول بما أنزل إليه من ربه والمؤمنون كل آمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله لا نفرق بين أحد من رسله وقالوا سمعنا وأطعنا غفرانك ربنا وإليك المصير. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. صدق الله العظيم. السلام عليكم.
Sadaqallahu al-Azim. Thank you very much, Brother Muhammad Jainul Abidin. Without further ado, I take pleasure to invite our Dean, Professor Dr. Abdulaziz Bergod, to deliver his welcoming speech.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Good afternoon, everyone here. Her Excellency, the Acting High Commissioner of Australian Embassy here in Malaysia, our beloved scholars, Professor Osman Bakar, Professor Murad, Professor Khalid, Professor Ozai, and all the professors who are with us here and also in the virtual following in the Zoom, all our participants, the NGOs, the government representatives, the student lecturers, the people who are waiting or following us in the Zoom from around 20 different countries, and also in the YouTube. These are our usual people and who follow our programs. This is a great day in Istac here to translate the collaboration between Istac and the High Commissioner Office of Australia here into this activity today, inviting one of the great scholars, Professor Muhammad Abdullah. For your information, a few years back, we invited him to Istac-Iium, and he delivered great lectures, and people remember him for his lectures, and they are waiting for him in the next few days to deliver a lecture. And those admirers of the concept of tajdeed, renewal and reform, you have to attend that lecture. So, brothers and sisters, this lecture comes in our effort to advance the cause of civilizational dialogue, the cause of civilizational studies, the cause of bringing people of different cultures, civilizations, faiths to deliberate and discuss issues and problems and challenges facing not Muslims, but humanity at large. So brothers and sisters, when we talk about Islam in Australia, for your information, our university have been doing this for the last 30 years. We organize programs about Islam in Africa, Islam in Asia, Islam in Japan, Islam in many parts of the world. And today, we would like to learn and know about Islam in Australia. And I'm sure it is unique and special. With this great special scholar here, we will learn a lot. You remember when we invited the scholar, the deputy mufti from Russia, to talk about Islam in Russia, and we learn from first-hand information about Islam in Russia. Today, we will learn about Islam in Australia from Professor Muhammad Abdullah. And I hope our scholars, our student, our participant here and in the Zoom and YouTube can go into discussion and deliberation on the challenges and the way forward, brothers and sisters. With this, once again, I welcome you all today to Istac, this garden of wisdom and virtue. And I welcome Professor Muhammad Abdullah, our guest today, and we wish and love to see him many other times. And also we talk for a plan for him in the near future. So we hijack him from South Australia University. Prof, go ahead. I think our sister wants to introduce you. Go ahead.
Yeah. All right. Okay, let me introduce you. Professor Abdullah. He aims to present on the topic of Islam in Australia, focusing on the history of Islam, its growth, and some of the opportunities and challenges faced by Australian Muslims, especially the youth. Okay, let me introduce him. Professor Abdullah worked in the field of Islamic studies for over 25 years and played a leading role in establishing Islamic studies across few Australian universities. In 2020, he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia, the highest recognition for outstanding achievement and service for significant service to education in the field of Islamic studies. In 2006, he established and led the Griffith University Islamic Research Unit at Griffith University, Brisbane. In 2008, he co-established the National Centre of Excellence for Islamic Studies with colleagues from the University of Melbourne and Western Sydney University. In 2016, he continued to serve as its founding director. And throughout this initiative, he attracted more than 15 million in funding. He also successfully supervised completion more than 20 higher degree by research, HDR students, PhD, masters, and honors. And he had the pleasure to supervise the current Minister of Malaysia, Mr. Anwar Ibrahim, PhD by publication, mashallah, and the master by research of the late Abdul Khalid bin Ibrahim, Chief Minister of Selangor from 2008 to 2014. He has been involved in high-profile academic conference and symposia, community activities, and media engagement. And he attained several civic awards, including Community Leadership, Islamic Council of Queensland Community Service Award, and Pride of Australia Medal, and so on. And he also served on several academic, community, and NGO boards, including editorial board of Humanomics, management board of National Center of Excellence for Islamic Studies, and there's a lot if I mention all, but there's one chairperson of the Queensland Muslim Community Reference Group and more. He have used his formal educational training and extensive community experience to build bridges of understanding and break down barriers through factual knowledge, sharing, and intercultural relationships. Okay, and he has published widely in the field of Islamic studies. I'll mention one or two. One is the Curriculum Renewal for Islamic Education. Okay, Routledge 2021 in Islamic Schooling in the West, Pathways to Renewal. in Palgrave, Macmillan. Without further ado, I would invite Professor Abdullah to deliver his speech.
Thank you. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم ربنا لك الحمد والشكر كما ينبغي لجلال وجهك وعظيم سلطانك اللهم إنا نعوذ بك منك لا نحصي ثناء عليك أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. I begin, of course, by praising Almighty God and send salutations on His messenger and also greet you with the universal Islamic greeting of Assalamu alaikum. May the peace of God be upon you all. It is my absolute pleasure to be with you here today amidst this distinguished group of people. And I won't go through the list of the distinguished people in the room. I will just cut and paste and say thank you so much for hosting me today. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught us something beautiful, and he said, whosoever doesn't thank people does not thank God. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank particularly the Australian High Commission, the Commissioner and the Acting Commissioner, and the wonderful team who have been feeding me all day very well, I must say. I've added a few kilograms already, so I'll blame you for the extra weight when I go back. And also for Istac and our respected Dean, Professor Barghouth, and others who are in this wonderful gathering today. I am delighted to be here, and I hope we will continue this collaboration in the future, inshallah, God willing. So I did have the slides here and they disappeared, but that's fine. I can maybe put them back on. Is that okay? I can't see them now. That's all right. Now, but you can't see them. That's the only thing. Before I put the slides up, just something quick about myself so that you know that I've been in Australia for quite some time now. I migrated with my family, my parents and brothers and sisters to Australia in 1985. Originally from Palestine, so that to get rid of any confusion that's in your mind as to where this man is from, because everybody likes to take a guess, Algeria, Somalia, Sudan, you name it. So let's clear the air from Palestine. Grew up in Jordan and migrated to Australia in 85. So I have been in Australia for a good 35 odd years. So I know Australia very well, and I love Australia, of course. And I have one son who was born in Australia, grew up in Australia, and my wife comes from an Anglo-Celtic background. She converted to Islam 25 odd years ago, and her parents also and her sister converted to Islam. So I say this just to let you know that I'm quite familiar with the Australian context, be it the Islamic Australian context or the wider Australian context. In addition to also serving as an academic, where, as you have read, as you have heard, in several universities, but I've worked extensively with communities, which to me is probably the most important thing that we can do as academics. And that is to translate the knowledge that we have into social impact. And of course, that engagement with the Australian Muslim communities and the wider Australian communities became more extensive and intensive after the tragic events of 9/11. Immediately after 9/11, the first mosque in the world, the first masjid in the world to be burned down to the grounds was my masjid in Brisbane 2 weeks after 9/11, 3 weeks. And the only thing that survived, and I say this because it's that silver lining. You know, we are taught to be hopeful, people of tafa'ul, people of optimism. And for those who know Arabic, and the shuyukh and the professors here, the only thing that survived in that masjid was a page from Riyadh al-Salihin. The Riyadh al-Salihin is a classical text of hadith by a great classical scholar by the name of An-Nawawi. And I used to read from that book every night to the congregation, one hadith after Isha prayer. And the only thing that survives is one page from that book. And on that book, on that page, the following hadith remained. قال عليه الصلاة والسلام ليس الشديد بالسرعة إنما الشديد الذي يملك نفسه عند الغضب. أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام, a strong person is not one who wrestles and defeats people, but one who controls himself or herself in times of anger. You know, that was a very profound for us, as if it was a message to say, this is the time you should restrain yourself, but also display the most beautiful traits of your faith, Islam. And so that plunged me deeply into engaging with various communities in Australia for the last 20 odd years. And I don't think there was a break in that 20 years. That's how intense the situation has been. So having said that background, you know, I will proceed, inshallah, just to say a few things about Islam in Australia in terms of history and so forth. And as you can imagine, I can't go into details because of time, but I'll be more than happy to discuss any of these issues, inshallah. In order to appreciate Islam's presence in Australia, it's important to realize that Australia has had a people known as the First Nations people, First Nations Australians, who were the different and distinct Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups. And these were, they had their own culture, their own language, their own set of beliefs and practices. And they have been living on the Australian continent for anything between 60,000 to 120,000 years. Now, to most of you, you may not have heard that before, but that makes them the longest surviving ongoing culture on the face of this earth. You know, so the Aboriginal people, or the first Australian people, are the longest, the world's oldest, longest surviving continuous culture. That's quite awesome when you think about it. That's really, really something spectacular. You know, especially for us Australians to be among people, rubbing shoulders with people who are that, is just, I found that to be completely astounding. And so this map that you see here, this is the map of the Aboriginal or First Peoples, which composes of about 250, reflects 250 indigenous languages. That is before white settlement, before anybody went to Australia, aside from the Aboriginal people, the First Peoples, they already had their own culture. They already had their own languages. They had 250 languages and 800 dialects, right? And they were different languages. There were 250 plus languages spoken on the continent in 1788. 120 languages were spoken in 2016, and 90% are considered endangered in 2019, right? So one of the things that I've been advocating to Islamic schools, for example, is to help revive the indigenous languages. When we speak about being inclusive, and if as Islamic schools, and I'll talk more about Islamic schools, inshallah, later, but is how possibly, if we are to play an important role, and we have played an important role in Australia as Muslims, but if we are to play, you know, more important roles, then possibly the idea of helping in reviving those indigenous languages. So, for example, maybe Islamic schools can have a special department, office, you name it, to dedicate it fully for the revival of some of these languages. That would be fantastic. Imagine if some of our students who graduate from Islamic schools can actually speak some of the local languages. I found this when I went to visit New Zealand, and I visited an Islamic school there. I was extremely impressed when at the graduation ceremony of, it's an all girls Islamic school, and they were doing most of their ceremony in the local Maori language. And not in a superficial way, in a very rich way. Now, given that context, the fact that the first peoples of Australia have been there for 60,000 plus years, what I will say next makes sense and gives us that sense of importance. The first people, as far as we know, to visit the Australian continent before European settlement were actually Muslims. And we know that in the 1700s, Muslims from Makassar, and you could see the map of Indonesia there, and you see how the island of Makassar is very close to the tip of Australia, Arnhem Land. We know there is substantial evidence to tell us that the Muslims of Indonesia from Makassar, Sulawesi, they came and visited Australia, and they traded with the Aboriginal people at least 150 years, 200 years before European settlement. Right? So when I speak to young Australian Muslims who deny their Australianness, and I'll talk about this later, there is an identity crisis among young Australian Muslims, generally speaking, and one of that includes, despite the fact they've been born in Australia and raised up in Australia, they would deny being Australian. And I say to them, in doing so, you deny Islam's long-standing historical presence in the country. Right, so that's an important point. Islam has had a long-standing historical presence in Australia. We can't deny that. And this is evidenced in the fact that the Makassar Muslims from Sulawesi came and had actually excellent relationships with the first peoples of Australia. They visited the shores of Arnhem Land every wet season for more than 200 years until 1907, when the White Australia policy came in. And what you see that is an image of the type of boat that they used to bring across when they came to trade with the first peoples of Australia. These are some depictions of that trade, the Aboriginal people's trade with the Makassar. And this relationship was a very positive relationship. And it's for an interesting reason. The first peoples of Australia, the Aboriginal people, did not see the Makassar Muslims as settlers, but as visitors. They saw them as mutual partners who came to trade with them. And they used to come and one of the things they used to trade in, for example, was something called tripang or sea cucumber. They would come and buy and sell that. And so, for example, in this statement, the Makassar did not settle in Arnhem Land, but they did have an influence on the Yolongo people's society and culture and ritual, right? Words such as rupiah, money, were introduced, and metal blades, knives, and axes, which transformed Yolongo life. The Yolongo are a tribe of Aboriginal people in Arnhem Land. And this is a drawing of the Aboriginal people in one of their caves that celebrates the visits of the Makassars to Australia. And they continue to do so. They continue to speak about the early visits of Muslims from Indonesia in positive terms. Here is a statement by a senior ranger from one of the Aboriginal tribes. He says, and people dance, people sing about them. And it's very important in these days for Yolonga people to remember them, that they came and they were the first contact for Yolonga people. After 1901, the newly formed Australian government banned tripangers from Makassar in order to protect Australia's territorial integrity and to encourage a local tripang industry. And in 1907, the last prau from Makassar visited Arnhem Land. And then you have a second wave of Muslims coming to Australia who also influenced the landscape of Australia, and these were the Cameliers. This is an image of a very important book that if you're interested in learning more about Australian Muslim Cameliers, this is an interesting book. And between 1860 and 1920, approximately 2,000 Cameliers arrived in Australia to participate in the historic Burke and Wills expedition. In doing so, really, they laid the railway foundation that linked the interior of Australia together. So they also introduced the camels, and that's why we have more camels in Australia than they have in Saudi. Right? We have more camels than they have in the Gulf, I think. These are images of the early cameleers. They were known as Muslim cameleers, but they weren't all Muslims. They had some substantial Muslim numbers, but they were Hindus and Sikh, and they came from India, they came from Baluchistan, they came from Hind and Sindh, and they played a very important role in, as I said, laying the railway system in Australia, because the camel was the only means of transportation that could do that. The picture that you see here is the first masjid that was built by the cameleers. It is in South Australia and it's still there. Obviously, it's not used as a masjid, but the Afghan cameleers, the first thing they did, because they came to settle, unlike the Makassars, they came to trade and went back. The Afghan cameleers, they came, and most of them came without their wives, so many of them ended up marrying Aboriginal ladies or married from Australia. And so you ended up having a generation of Australians who were from Afghan and Aboriginal parents. Many of them have lost their Islamic identity, so the names are still there. If you go to places like Alice Springs, you might come across Aboriginal people there with the surname Abdullah and Khan, but they are not Muslim anymore. But they will take you to their houses and show you pictures of their fathers and grandfathers with the umama, with the turban and the sharwal and the kameez, right? I have a very close friend at the university, at UNSA, Professor Irabina Rigni. He is also an Aboriginal elder and a distinguished professor of education and Aboriginal education. And he always says to me, he says, brother, he says, in my family, I have the Abdallahs and the Singhs. They have the Abdullah in his family tree. So this is the oldest mosque in Australia. It still stands in a place called Maree. It's about 8 hours drive from Adelaide. And there's the second oldest mosque is in the city of Adelaide, where I reside. This is the masjid, and it says, this is a memorial park. At the top it says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, most merciful, most compassionate. This is dedicated to the memory of the pioneer Muslim cameleer, the cameleers and families of Hergot Spring, Maree. May you enjoy its peace and tranquility, etc. And often people go to visit it, and young Australian Muslims often go to visit it to connect with that history. So from 1860 to 1900s, these cameleers and their ships of the desert became the backbone of the Australian economy. Right? However, and this you might find this surprising, there is evidence emerging now that may demonstrate that actually Muslims may have come to Australia 1,000 years ago. Right? And according to The Guardian in 2019, it says this new discovery could change everything. Coin found off Northern Australia may be from pre-1400 Africa. And what this is talking about is several coins that were found in Northern Territory. I believe they were found in the 1940s, but the person who found them, he was, I think, an ex-soldier who was guarding the shores, and he came across these coins. He kept them for a while, didn't pay attention to them, then gave them to a museum, and they recently began exploring those. What they found in the back of these coins is the statement Sultanate Kilwa, Arabic words that speak about this district called Kilwa in Tanzania, which is more than 10,000 kilometers away from Australia. And the coins had come from Kilwa, and they found that these coins are actually 1,000 years old. And you have to remember that Tanzania and other African countries at the time, they were affluent. They were at their peak in terms of civilization and in terms of knowledge. And they weren't poor nations, they were very affluent nations. And so what experts believe that they have found a Kilwa coin that could change what we know about history of global trade and also about Islam's presence in Australia. And this particular professor, McIntosh, I think his surname, he is leading this observation or this exploration. And he says that they may be 1,000 years old and could rewrite Australian history. Now, there are two theories here. One is that those coins would have made it through some Tanzanian traders to Australia 1,000 years ago. That's a possibility, not proven. Or they may have come through Australia via the Macassars. So they may have, the Tanzanian Muslims may have traded with Indonesia at the time and exchanged those coins, and these coins made their way to Australia. Either way, either case, it's a fascinating history, right? And so again, it speaks again volumes about the importance of recognizing Islam's long-standing historical presence in Australia, right? Of course, post World War I and World War II, there were waves of Muslim migration from Turkey, from Albania, from Lebanon, and so forth. Many came after Lebanese civil war, and that's why the predominant Muslim community in Australia are from Lebanese background, especially in New South Wales and Victoria, followed by Turkish and others. Today, as was mentioned earlier, the Muslim population in Australia is 813,392, to be precise. Now, that's a jump of almost 200,000 from the last census. In the 2016 census, there were 640,000. That's a good jump, right? And of course, many people will say this is the official census, what we don't know the actual numbers. And so the estimates that the numbers might be higher. There is a cultural diversity. Australia is a melting pot. And so we have Muslims literally from all walks of life. And they make up, or they come from 183 different cultures or countries, which is excellent. And you know, now the slogan is strength in diversity, but it's also challenging because we can't agree, for example, when to start Eid and Ramadan, right? And we are just going through that wave again now with Eid al-Adha. And so you have different camps. So those who have already decided that Eid is on Tuesday, and those who decided it's on Wednesday, and those who decided it's on Thursday. So you have, I think that maybe the beauty of that is that you have a selection, right? You can choose. So the advantage of having so many Muslims from diverse cultures is that it adds richness, and it no longer makes Islam and Muslims monolithic, but it is super diverse. And it's an opportunity to learn from other Muslims. But as I said earlier, it can be a challenge because it can come across as fragmented. And that is perhaps one of those challenges that we can talk about also. So what I gave you is just a very brief history really of Islam and Muslims in Australia, and happy to discuss that even further. But because of time, I'll move on. Now, in terms of opportunities, well, the fact that Australia is an advanced democracy, there are many, many, many opportunities there. The very fact there is freedom of thought and practice, and the law protects all. And this is something that we witness. I mean, we actually live in a country as Muslims where freedom of thought and practice is well respected and is manifested. And so, and that has translated in the form of opening of masjids freely, without any restrictions, opening of mosques, Islamic schools, which I will talk about more, the freedom to speak and talk about Islam as you see fit, of course, with the caveat that post 9/11, there were rightfully some restrictions on discourse that may create hate, Islamic discourse that might create hate or division in communities. And so naturally, there were certain laws that needed to be introduced in order to curtail that possibility. So as an Australian Muslim, I practice my faith freely. We teach Islam at the universities freely. We go to the mosque any time of the day and night freely. We can open tahfidh al-Quran, memorization of the Quran freely. All of that is happening. Halal food, halal butchers, you name it, restaurants, all there. And also the law protects all in Australia, regardless of your background. Of course, and one of the challenges that we will talk about is Islamophobia and racism and discrimination. But this is where the law comes in. And I always say, and I truly believe in this, that no country is free of racism, right? However, one, I think, distinguishing mark about Australia is that we have institutions and infrastructures that can allow us to fight back. You can fight that racism and you can fight Islamophobia to a large extent. You can even fight the government and the media. I have had certain issues with Australia's largest media outlet in 2006 or 7, where I and my center at the university were attacked severely and wrongfully. And I fought back for 2.5 years, the largest paper in the country. And I won against them a defamation case. And I use that as a case study for young Australian Muslims to say that you can fight within the confines of the law, with civility and the confines of the law. You don't have to lose yourself and your values and your standards, nor should you lower your standards to fight back. And also other case studies. There is a famous case of, some of you may not be familiar, Dr. Muhammad Hanif was an Indian doctor who was working at the Gold Coast. He was on a work visa, in fact. He was not on permanent residency, nor was he an Australian citizen. So you could say he wasn't really protected by the law. And when the London bombing happened, his cousin was involved in that. He had left London earlier and left his SIM card with his cousin. And so they traced back the SIM to him. His wife was in India, pregnant, and so he bought a one-way ticket to go and visit her. And of course, he was already under watch. And so buying a one-way ticket, made it even worse for him. There's a lot of red flags. So he was stopped at the airport in Brisbane, and under the Howard government, he was detained 2-3 weeks without charge. But there was a massive upheaval in the community, not by Muslims, by everybody, that it was an unfair case. And I was involved heavily in that case, and many others who were Muslims and non-Muslims. Cut long story short, Dr. Muhammad Hanif was released. His visa was reinstated, and he fought the entire government. He had a case, a court case against the government of the day and the organizations of the day who put him in that predicament, and he won against them. And he was given a substantial monetary compensation. And I use this example to say, sometimes in majority Muslim countries, you can't do that, to stand up and fight honestly for this type of justice. So when we want to look at a place like Australia, we have to be, to have this concept of equity and fairness in our outlook. And whilst there are some limitations, but there are also these possibilities where you can fight back, actually. And you may not be able to do that elsewhere. We are beginning to see political representation, and this is increased after, believe it or not, after Christchurch. For 20 years, we suffered in Australia, and I can say that without hesitation. Post 9/11 and the burning of the mosque, it was a very difficult time for Muslims in Australia, primarily because of media's misrepresentation and political discourse. It was savage. It was quite vicious, actually. And the Christchurch massacre, sadly, if one could say, brought an end to that. Because suddenly there was this realization that actually Islamophobia will kill. Just like Islamic extremism kills, but also Islamophobia can lead to people dying. And that's what happened in Christchurch. I went the next day to Christchurch. I visited the community there. I went a couple of times, and I witnessed firsthand what they had gone through. And so suddenly there was that shift in Australia. Christchurch happened. It's sad that we had to wait for an event like that. And suddenly there was that shift. I mean, I recall, and this is part of the challenges, but which would lead me to this political representation. I recall going to an emergency meeting in Sydney with the imams. Is anyone keeping eye on the time to stop me when? Fine, okay. I promise you I won't take 3 hours. I'll try to finish quickly. So I recall I was invited to an emergency meeting in Sydney with the imams. The imams, we have a national umbrella called Australian National Imams Council, which I will talk about in a second. And I was one of their founders. I was their vice president and spokesperson for a while. And we were in a meeting of 20 imams, maybe like this. This was during the time of one particular prime minister. It is still before Christchurch. And I looked around the faces of the imams, and you could see the weight of stress and concern. Because the imams were playing the leading role in calming tensions, which was often overlooked. The important role of imams is often overlooked. And I asked all of them, how do you feel at this point in time? And that's because of certain statements that a prime minister made. They gave negative statements about Muslims. And they all said, they all felt like we just can't win. They felt like we don't know what to do to make things different. That was the weight of the responsibility. And the shift happened after Christchurch in more positive ways. And I think this is a lesson for all of us, not just in Western context, but other contexts. We shouldn't wait for a tragedy to allow us to conceptualize and think of minority communities in more positive ways. Let's not wait for tragedies, because that's sadly what happened. A big tragedy. And so, in a way, the challenges in Australia for Muslims opened those opportunities, the opportunity to engage. Before 9/11, most Australian Muslims were their own enclaves, their own shells. They were comfortable in their convenience, in their comfort zones. And 9/11 happens, unlike this is the same story in the USA and elsewhere, we were forced to come out and start trying to build relations. Post Christchurch, this increased in positive ways where there was more political representation. And so now today we have the Fatima Payman, who became the parliament's first hijab wearing Muslim woman. When not long ago, there was an attack in the parliament against the hijab and the niqab or the burqa by one of the senators. And now you have a senator who's hijab wearing, right? And she is an excellent role model for young Muslims in Australia. We have also Mahreen Faruqi, who was the first female Muslim senator. She was, of Pakistani background. We also have now Ed Husich, the first federal MP sworn in on the Quran. And he's now the Minister for Industry and Science since 2020, of Bosnian background, right? So you have Bosnian background, Pakistani background, and Afghani background. It's quite interesting, right? You also have Dr. Ayan Ali. She is now the Minister for Early Childhood and Education, of Egyptian background. Originally, she was an academic, and her area of expertise was actually radicalization and terrorism. And then she became now a politician. You also have in New South Wales the Minister for Customer Service and Digital Government, Jihad Deep, of Lebanese background. All of them of different cultural backgrounds, but all Australians are playing a very important role in Australian politics today. These are the opportunities. I think, and this is the nature of Australian governance system, is that there are these opportunities. You just have to be involved. You have to take part. It is not enough to simply be just a number in Australia. The opportunities are there to be involved. The opportunities are there to open Islamic studies centers in universities. The opportunities are open to take part in politics. The opportunities are open to open Islamic schools. The challenge for us internally as Muslims is how do you make the best use of these opportunities? And of course, the masajid, we have many masajid, many mosques. I don't know the numbers, perhaps in the hundreds, at least 304 masjids or mosques in Australia. And they continue to be established. Dare I say, there has been some challenges in getting some approval, council approval for some of these masjids, primarily because of opposition from local communities. And this is because this is on the back of the fear of Islam and Muslims, which was a direct consequence of 9/11, media's misrepresentation, political discourse, and so forth. Now that is beginning to ease, so we do have masajid. The mosques are independent entities. They're not controlled by government or by state. They each have their own committee or trustees, and they operate in their own in the way they see fit. They often have an appointed full-time imam who is appointed and by the committee. In most masajid, most mosques, you'll find, in addition to the 5 times salah and khutbahs, you have Quran classes, you have Arabic classes, you have madrasa, you have convert classes or classes for new Muslims. They are used as, places of marriage and places of counseling places and so forth. And there are no restrictions to going to the mosque and what to do in the mosque. There was, of course, a phase there where speaking, using a extremist Islamic discourse, of course, came to an end. And that's good. I think that's a very good thing. We don't want any form of extremism, whether it is, Islamic or otherwise. And so most of the discourse now in the mosques are, related to community affairs. One of the challenges, of course, is that we still have imported imams. No, of course, disrespect to any of these imams. They are great imams in their own right. They have studied in reputable universities, but if they don't speak English, it's a challenge. That's number one. Secondly, even if they spoke English, they may not have, all of them, the necessary training to contextualize Islam for Muslims in Australia or to make it relevant. And I'll touch on this also when I speak about Islamic schools. Are you still following, or I'm putting you to sleep?
Yeah, great.
You're right? Yes? Okay, you're not thinking of, we had lunch, all of us. You're not thinking of post-lunch, because I was told there are 5 meals in Malaysia, plus the in-between. So, all right. So, I go to a mosque called Al-Khalil Mosque in Adelaide. It's a very large mosque. It even has its own cemetery. But this is the only masjid in Australia that is own private cemetery. Right. The masajid, as I said, few hundreds, there are prayer facilities, and also most universities have musallas. Most universities in Australia, they have a prayer facility for Muslims to do their Jum'ah, Friday sermons, but also 5 times salah. When I first joined UniSA, they had a small room because in the campus, very, very tiny, because there weren't many Muslims. So I asked them to just renovate that very small room that accommodated 4 people. And instead they went and spent a couple of $100,000 to renovate a bigger room. And they made it a proper musalla, well segregated for the men and the women with wudu facilities. And every Ramadan they host an iftar. Most universities will host an iftar to make the Muslims feel included. And they also take part in the Eid festivals and so forth. So there is no problems there. But also schools generally, public schools in Australia now are moving towards this trend where they want to make Australian Muslim students feel included. And so they have prayer facilities in schools. We have about 46 Islamic schools and growing. The first Islamic school was established in 1984, I beg your pardon, 1984. If you include the schools which are run by Turkish communities, but they don't call themselves Islamic, but they are. So they are 99% Muslim students. And they have the Australian national curricula, but also they have Islamic studies and so forth. If you were to include them, then that's about 72 schools in Australia. If you were to exclude them and talk about those that call themselves Islamic, you have 46 and growing. In fact, there is an exponential growth of schools in the West, Islamic schools, including Australia. And for your information, the best, or the Islamic schools that have the best facilities, opportunities, and government support are actually in Australia. When our counterparts in the USA or Britain or Canada hear about the privileges Islamic schools have in Australia, they actually become envious. Seriously. Whether it's the salaries, whether it's the government support. So these are private schools that are funded by government. They run the Australian national curricula and they include Islamic studies. So there are two models that are used. One is the appendage model, where they add Islam on the side, but the focus is on national curricula and academic performance. Or now you have beginning to see the integrated model, where they integrate parts of Islam in every course, and usually by sprinkling verses of the Quran and ayat, or verses of the Quran and ahadith of the Messenger of Allah in what they teach. And there is a third model that we are advocating for, we meaning the Center for Islamic Thought and Education, through this concept of tajdeed, and that is the transformative model, where we are saying Islamic schools must overhaul everything they do, going back essentially to basics and using the Islamic paradigm and worldview as their foundation. What Islamic schools do now is superimpose a model, an education model, which is not wrong in itself and of itself, but superimpose a model, in this case, a Australian national curricula, which is heavily secular in nature, on an Islamic school, expecting that the students will graduate with Islamic and academic excellence collectively, and that's not happening. So what Islamic schools have done at best is create a dichotomy between the Islamic and the non-Islamic. And so you have this separation. You have everything here, which they may call, secular, and I don't like to use that word when we talk about knowledge. And of course, Ustad Osman Bakr and the other teachers here are more proficient in this than I am. We don't categorize knowledge in this way, but knowledge for us is one big circle, and it's the intent and the application that makes it this or that. And then you have the Islamic on the side, often in the form of 2-hour classes on Islam or Quran. And of course, there is the masjid there, the salah, and so forth. And what this model, whether in the USA or the Australia or the UK or Canada, we have found that this model is not serving its purposes of attaining the objectives of Islamic education. And we can dig that deeper, if you like, later. If we were to ask ourselves, what are the fundamental objectives of education generally from an Islamic perspective? And if Islamic schools in the West were established to achieve that, i.e. the preservation of the Islamic identity of the learner and the connection of the learner with the creator, and this idea of the ma'rifatullah, the cognizance of God, and the refinement of the self, and of course, academic excellence. So the holistic education of the child, intellectually, academically, spiritually, and otherwise, to a large extent, that has not been achieved in Islamic schools in the West. And so a transformative model would require a rethinking of not only what is taught in Islamic schools, but why it is taught and how it is taught. Islamic schools are represented by an Islamic School Association of Australia, and our center holds the only conference on Islamic schools, and the 6th Islamic Schooling Conference is coming up in August. That's an open invitation to everybody. And the 6th Islamic Schooling Conference is on the question of afiyah, well-being. Because sometimes in the process of trying to achieve academic excellence, we may end up compromising the afiyah of the student. And the afiyah, I mean by that in its holistic understanding. And that is well-being, the spiritual, intellectual, physical well-being. That is why, for example, we know that there is an identity crisis among young Australian Muslims, and maybe young Muslims in the West generally. And instead of maybe helping resolve that identity crisis, unwittingly, some Islamic schools exacerbate that identity crisis. And so by sheltering the student in an Islamic school where we are not equipping them to deal genuinely with life's challenges from an Islamic perspective, then we are setting them for failure, setting them up for failure. So when they are released into the real world and now encounter those isms and ideologies and ideas, and they feel, well, what do I do now? They go two ways. Often they abandon the faith altogether and they become murtad, apostates. They leave Islam because they feel that Islam doesn't have the answers. Or their identity is seriously challenged, either by not practicing the faith, abandoning the faith, or some of them becoming actually very strict in the faith, which is, and this is an area of interesting area which we can explore further. Anyway, but I don't want to take too much of your time. So the umbrella Islamic organizations include the Australian National Imams Council, established in 2006 in response to several issues. One, we had a mufti, an appointed mufti in Australia, and interestingly, the USA does not have a mufti, nor does the UK, but Australia has a mufti. We have a mufti who is a mufti for Australia and New Zealand, despite the fact that the New Zealand brothers and sisters don't know about it, right? So, and it was more of a political appointment at the time. And the statements of that particular mufti, he was doing a lot of good work with the community, but some statements were problematic and caused some level of harm to the community. So the Imams of Australia got together and said, we need to form an umbrella organization. And I was of those people who formed this, but then I pulled out 6 months after for different reasons. It is now it has 250 imams. Then you have the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils that is supposed to represent the councils and not to indulge in fatwa giving or issuing or religious matters, but they are now. So they are seen as competition to each other, sadly. And instead of complementing each other work, now there is a heavy competition between them, even on issues such as Eid and Ramadan and Halal. That is a challenge. And that actually creates further confusion. And until recently, we didn't have any Islamic organization that actually lobbied on behalf of the Muslim community at the political and media level in a substantive way. Now we do have Australian Muslim Advocacy Network, and I'm a board of that. We established this some time ago for this very particular purpose, where we are now advocating at the very highest legal, political, and media levels for the welfare of the Muslim community. I said universities have Islamic studies, and one of those is our university, University of South Australia. I was invited in 2016 to establish the Center for Islamic Thought and Education. Halal food is everywhere, of course. And also, just quickly, some of the challenges, I've already touched on those, but racism and Islamophobia remain big challenges. Sorry. That began to diminish somewhat after Christchurch. And so open Islamophobia is not witnessed anymore in terms of media's rhetoric and political representation or discourse, that we don't see that anymore. But online Islamophobia is still rampant. We assumed that after Christchurch that might reduce, but actually it increased. And that's, you know, social media being what it is. So that is one thing that we are trying to fight with AMAN, Australian Muslim Advocacy Network, and we managed to begin to speak with platforms like Facebook and Twitter. In fact, I co-authored a high-profile paper on this matter, and that is the dehumanization of Muslims by Facebook and Twitter, where we compiled for the first time hundreds and hundreds of examples to demonstrate the dehumanization of Muslims on Facebook and Twitter, and the negative consequence of that in terms of hate against Muslims and so on. That remains to be one of our biggest challenges, and we are trying to work with government and social media to try to curb that somehow, without, of course, taking away the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of thought. So 3 years after Christchurch mosque attack, Australian Muslims still face Islamophobia. As I said, within 2 weeks of the Christchurch attack, offline reports to the Islamophobia Register Australia quadrupled. We have an Islamophobia register, and the reports to it quadrupled after Christchurch. Online attacks against Muslims were 18 times higher than average. And often it's women who are the subject of attack because of their visibility, and children. Sadly, most of the attacks were in public places. But the fourth Islamophobia report began, which was released last year, began to show some signs of improvement in some areas. So the number of reported incidents of discrimination at workplaces and schools have increased in the past 2 years. There have been fewer reports of Islamophobic incidents in the public, and the drop has been attributed to the pandemic lockdown. So we are still having this challenge that we need to fight. A report by the Australian Human Rights Commission found the majority of Muslims in Australia have experienced some form of discrimination in their lifetime, yet many still see Australia as a welcoming country. And perhaps on final notes, the youth, we do have a youth identity crisis for various reasons. I mean, you imagine this. If you were born in Australia post 9/11, and you grew up in an environment of Islamophobia and so forth, then naturally you would feel that you don't belong. So, and not having a sense of belonging can have serious consequences. People who don't feel they belong anywhere, they become vulnerable to anything. I engage a lot with young people. Aside from the academic work, I have every Saturday classes for young Muslims aged 10 to 15. And I engage with this group because it's a very important group. I have a special program for them called Applied Islam. It's a 2-year program, and I'm extending it by 3 more years. The cohort that I have are 50 young Muslims, both boys and girls, 2 classes. The retention rate is 100%. Despite the fact that they don't have to come on a Saturday between 3 and 4 and 4 and 5. There are no assessments, there are no exams, and they keep coming back because we are addressing these issues. So I have just finished with those young people a whole module called Who Am I? Islam, Culture and Identity. And at the beginning of this class, and I did this experiment in every state almost in Australia, or most states, I asked them before, how do you identify yourself? And I put a list of questions or options on the board. Are you Australian Muslim, Muslim Australian, just Australian? Are you Muslim Australian of Bangladeshi background or ex background? Are you an alien? Did you come from Mars? Did you come from, which planet did you come from, right? And what is astonishing is that 99% of them, despite the fact being born in Australia or know no other country but Australia, deny the Australia. And so you begin to dig deep why you ask this and that, and these issues of discrimination, Islamophobia, not feeling a sense of belonging. So my role and the role of every institution, this is where Islamic schools come handy, and madrasas and masjids and otherwise, how do you then, and this is a very important question, from an Islamic jurisprudential perspective that deals with context, how do you help young Australian Muslims or young Muslims reconcile between their Australian identity and their Islam? And I ask this question because young Australian Muslims, one of the reasons there is an identity crisis is because their inability to reconcile between being Muslim and Australian. There is something in the head that says to them that both cannot be compatible. So what is it that you can teach those young people to make them feel that actually there is some level of, there is compatibility? And hence, what I have found that this is an 8 weeks course, actually. It's not a 1 hour program where you and one of the reasons you find there is an inferiority complex. So it's all made, this identity crisis is a result of several, what I call internal and external challenges. The external challenges include Islamophobia, racism, these external challenges, not having a sense of belonging. These are some external challenges. Internal challenges, a failure to understand the history of Islam. For example, Islamic civilization. Most don't even have the basic knowledge about Islam's contribution to civilization. And that the West won't be today where it is, will not be where it is today without the Islamic impulse. And so by necessity, if we are to raise the level of confidence in young Muslims generally in a globalized world, and in this case, Australian Muslims, it is not enough to simply talk about what Islam says about identity, but let's go back and look about how did Islamic civilization in the past engage with other cultures and civilizations, which was very positive by and large, and what were the reasons that allowed Islamic civilization to engage? Why is it that the Islamic civilization was willing to appropriate the knowledge of the Greeks and spend 300 years translating it into Arabic and then substantially contributing to it? Why? When they could have taken the easier option by destroying it all in the name of a different worldview. Okay, so so this is one of the challenges that we are facing, but also lack of unity around things like beginning of Ramadan. I'll finish here, and thank you very much for listening. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you very much, Professor Abdullah, for your very beneficial speak. So Islam in Australia is amazing. They picture a better meaning of adapting harmonious measures among the multiracial and multicultural people. And they came to learn from us, but it seems that we should learn more from them, much more from them. And I'm amazed how supportful the Australian Commission, High Commission Malaysia is, in supporting Islamic programs by a great Muslim scholar like Professor Abdullah. Let's give them a big applause. And the term used by Prof. Abdullah is Islam is well respected and greatly manifested in Australia. And the important element is they have the free to speak, and speaking is not just about protecting rights of the people. It allows the development of knowledge in people, the mind of the people, free expressions the spirit of the people. And despite the challenges, people grow towards perfection and peace. As Rumi says, the brightest stars will appear and shine in the darkest night. Okay, now we open the floor to questions. If there is any questions. Oh, I have one in the chat. What is the approach of dealing with differences among Muslim groups in the Australian context?
I'm assuming that you're about Muslims themselves, the difference among Muslims.
Correct.
So you'll find most masajid or mosques are cosmopolitan in their nature. So you have people from different backgrounds in a given masjid. And that is usually a very cohesive, very peaceful relationship that they have among themselves, primarily because the committee tends to try to be inclusive. And also the imam of the mosque tries to be also inclusive. What we find that imams, for example, who come with a particular school of thought, particular madhab, very quickly learn that you can't just stick to that madhab because the people sitting in your masjid come from all schools of thoughts, and people who don't know what school of thought actually they are from. So that level of sometimes flexibility allows for that coherency among Muslims. That's number one. Secondly, I think you have activities that bring them together. So you won't find the Bengali Muslim community doing Eid on their Eid festival on their own. There'll be one Eid festival that brings all of them together. You'll find in Ramadan, they all come together. In Ramadan type of iftars, they all come together. And also you find that the discourse of several imams and leading Muslim scholars about working together as community is important, that diversity is strength and so on. So these are some of sort of very natural by default type responses to that diversity. Wherever there has been some tension in certain communities between different ethnic groups, you would often find some of the leading imams of that area would come to the fore and intervene and try to minimize that damage or control that situation. We have local councils, Islamic councils in every state that also play a leading role in that. So these are some ways that we are used to do that.
Okay, we have a question over that side.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I do believe that Islam is a very respected religion in the world. But we have seen today that it's a very serious problem in Ummah. People might not understand Islam in detail, how the religions, especially abroad. When we are facing a very serious turmoil with Islam, so non-Muslim, which are using the word of Islamophobia, xenophobia, anti-Semitic, what is the perception of the Islam itself to this? Today we have seen that people who can able to control the Masjid al-Aqsa, who can control the world. How is the perception of the respect of the Muslim people when people are talking about himself, that I am a Muslim, but at the end, there's nothing about Muslim people who understand really about Islam. Today we have seen that Islam is becoming a threat to others and labeling Islam as a terrorist. At one time, one of the Senator Pauline Hanson, making a derogative remarks in the Parliament House against Islam, especially a woman was wearing a burqa. Isn't it respectful for the Muslim people? And we are facing these challenges. And what are the policy of the Australian against the policy which related to the Muslim people, which we understand through the concept of peace building? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Is that?
Want to say something? No, I think we could not get exactly the question of our friend. I think he's talking about how Islam deals with the questions of Islamophobia in the context, let's say, of Australia, and then how the Australian react to this type of approach or understanding. So what is your advice on this? I think that's what I could gather.
I can say that the obstacles and the turmoil.
The obstacles that Muslims face in this context of Islamophobia or xenophobia, or so how are we going to maybe go about it and deal with it?
And thank you very much for your question. Are you asking broadly Muslims as an ummah, or are you talking about Australia? Oh yeah, so it's a question for everybody then, not for me. Right, Dr. Usman, tafadhal.
First of all, thank you, Prof. Nice to see you again. I would like to pose a question as an academic. I would like to see, yes, and you emphasize that even up to events have happened in New Zealand and so on. The incidents there was Muslims facing various forms of discrimination, harassment, and so on. This have increased rather than decreased. But I would look at another issue. Can you tell us if you were to take three main sectors that could influence things in this case, Australia? First, the academia. Second is the media. Third is the what I call this the interfaith arena, the interfaith the dialogue, intercultural dialogue. How do you see after September 11, in terms of effectiveness, in terms of impact? I'm saying it because I remember, if I'm not mistaken, immediately after September 11, I think that was the earliest. I attended a program organized by Dr. Shahram Akbarzadeh in Melbourne. And then the foreign minister of Australia was officiated by him. So that kind of followed. In other words, there was a series of, I think that Latrobe University, yes, series of events. And then, is there anybody doing a kind of impact study as far as, as the academia is concerned?
Yes.
Have we done enough? In other words, or somehow it's just confined impact to the classroom, but not really to outside. That's one. Then, of course, the other is media. I mean, how do you assess the impact of the following the September 11? I mean, what are the positive things, negative things, the more negative or positive as far as media is concerned? But from the way you mentioned, is of course it's negative. Mainly it's negative. And third, what about the dialogue, interfaith dialogue?
Yeah.
So I think so how is that effect from the media? From the interfaith dialogue in terms of the work they're doing. So overall, the balance sheet. I mean, what's that in terms of whether we have moved forward? Yes, can be parallel development. You always have the negative side of it, but not also to forget those who are doing the good things, the positive impact for the Muslims in so despite the negative thing, there are some. Yeah. I think I would like you to say about that.
Well, thank you very much for that, Professor. And I'll answer that. And I'm not sure if we answered the other gentleman's question, which we can also address briefly, and that is the state of the Ummah, particularly. Look, there is no doubt, as several contemporary Muslim leading scholars have said recently, that perhaps the Muslim Ummah faces one of its worst periods in the history of Islamic civilization in terms of knowledge and practice, particularly practice. And this is for several reasons, be it the aftermath of colonization and now also globalization, and of course 9/11 and the subsequent interventions in Muslim lands post 9/11, etc. So as a Muslim Ummah, there are severe challenges that we are facing, no doubt about that. And institutions, academic institutions and otherwise, need to play, and some of them do, like Istac here, you're playing a leading role in trying to address Islamic thought and trying to say, well, how can we move forward as an Ummah collectively? It is going to be a long path. I think it's going to be a long way, but we can start individually. I think sometimes we fall in the trap of just keep pointing the finger at everybody else without looking at our own selves. As a Muslim, we are first also to look at our own selves and say, well, how much of Islam is actually in my life? And how much do I practice that on a daily basis? And so we can start there. And then, of course, we hope that our Ummah there will be a form of resurgence, not only at the societal level, but at the government and the government's level. How long will that take? Allahu A'lam. But there are challenges, no doubt. However, the fact that the Ummah is undergoing severe challenges should not stop us from facing and trying to put a stop to things like Islamophobia, and to do what is within our domain, to try to challenge and fight and stand up against anything that we might feel will bring harm, not only to Muslims, I think to humanity at large. And that's why perhaps the next big challenge on all of us as humans is AI. You know, there's been so much talk about that, artificial intelligence. So the question for Muslim organizations, Islamic thought institutions, and otherwise is what are we going to be, what is the discourse that is going to come from our end to try to now deal with AI from a moral, ethical, and other perspectives. As for your questions now, in Australia, academically, there has been several studies that looked at the extent and the impact of Islamophobia. There has been, and that continues to be, but also there has been some, but not many studies that looks at the resilience of the Muslim community, for example, post 9/11 and post Christchurch. I think now we are post 9/11. Has there been enough academic research? No, there hasn't. There hasn't been. I think there can be more room for research in trying to understand not only the negative impacts on the Muslim community, say, of Australia, but also understand the positive impact. So, for instance, we do know anecdotally that there has been a huge amount of engagement of the Muslim community with the larger Australian communities post 9/11. And that engagement has been overly positive, right? But that hasn't been documented or researched. I can tell you, for example, I myself, after the burning of our masjid, visited Australia, many parts of Australia, back and forth for the last 20 years, and some very difficult areas, what we may call in Australia redneck towns, right? Very redneck towns where I was warned not to go there. But I went there and I stayed for a couple of days to speak about Islam, and the response was always positive. What that taught me is that more important than lectures and seminars and academic papers is face-to-face engagement. There can be the human element is more powerful than anything else. When you give a human face to the other and allow the other to define them for themselves who they are, that creates a magical strong bond immediately, and it breaks down barriers, right? Now, has that been documented? No, it hasn't been documented to a large extent. So there needs to be much more work on that. In terms of the interfaith dialogue, there has been a lot of interfaith dialogue, but again, the first PhD student in Australia that looked at interfaith dialogue between, in this case, Muslims and Christian groups was a PhD student of mine who just graduated. And he was of Christian background himself. And what he had found, he looked at the barriers and the factors that help in interfaith dialogue and the barriers. And he found mostly the barriers are not religious, but institutional or infrastructural. And interestingly, he found Muslims generally are more open to dialogue than, in this case, Christians in Australia, in the Australian context. And again, from the Christian side, it wasn't because they don't want to engage, but for them, the church itself was beginning to lose value in the eyes of their own community, and it was accommodating the very senior people only, and they were busy just retaining those senior people coming to the church. They had no time for interfaith dialogue. But much more research is probably needed in this regard. Wallahu alam.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. I am Insaf from Sri Lanka, PhD candidate in Istac. I would like to know Australian Muslims' contribution for nation building. Thank you.
I think they're contributing on everyday basis. I think we should never underestimate that. I can give you an example. Recently, I met one Muslim medical doctor of Bangladesh background. They have the Bangladesh Muslim Association, Muslim Medical Association of South Australia. This is one. You have the Pakistani also. And the Minister of Health met with them at a conference, and she said to them, if you were to pull out, if you Muslim medical doctors in this state to stop working, we will collapse. Right? So that is one. But again, coming back to the previous question, this is not often highlighted in media or by politicians, the great day-to-day contributions of Muslims, whether it's in the medical field or in the engineering or whatever it might be, or even in education. And we are beginning to see, of course, in academia, in politics and academia. Is it enough? No. I think one of the biggest challenges or downfalls of the Muslim community is changing mindsets. How do you, and this is one thing that we face in Australia, how do you change the mindset, for example, so that investment is not always going to bricks and mortar buildings? How do you change mindset so that investment is always not going to building yet another masjid, but rather investing in minds, investing in institutions? And we find that to be exceptionally difficult, because the traditional, conventional idea is that when you want to give a sadaqah or your zakah or contribute your finances, it has to go to a certain segment of society only, and people are willing to give. But when you say, for example, we want to train the next best jurists in Australia, legal jurists, or we want to invest in having more institutions that can study, for example, a longitudinal study to look at the impact of Islamic schooling on Muslim students in Australia for the next 10 years. Or the impact of Australian Muslim contributions. I mean, you've heard Islam has been in Australia for a long time. Just like as the Cameliers contributed, there are 800,000 Muslim Australians today, and they do make substantial contributions. That hasn't been studied well enough. And so the shift of mind, that shifting in the mind shift, is to say, well, we don't lack as Muslims in Australia, and by extension as an ummah, we don't lack the talent nor the resources. But perhaps, coming back to early question, we lack that vision and the strategy to achieve that vision. So for Australian Muslims, I always ask them, where do you want to be 20 years from now? I used to say 50 years from now, until Rahmatullah alayhi, not Tutunji, what's his name? Abdul Hamid, yeah. The other, not Abdul Sulaiman, anyway. He said to me, no, 50 years is too long. Make it start with 20 years. So you ask, where do you want to be as a Muslim community in Australia 20 years from now? What is your vision? And then what is your strategy to achieve that vision? And then you channel your resources towards that. Otherwise, it'll be very fragmented approach to achieving something that we are not sure what it is. Right? So yes, there are ongoing nation building happening in Australia. There are challenges, of course, but I think we can definitely do better, and we are growing. So we are learning quickly. We are learning. Wallahu alam.
This is Khalid, Istac student. Firstly, compliments to the Australian government, which is helping Muslim schools or Islamic schools with support. And I was just thinking that the Indian government could learn from them, number one. Number two is you just spoke about having co-authored a paper about the impact of Facebook and Twitter on the dehumanization, and wanted to know whether you had sent it to the parties concerned, the stakeholders, and did you receive any response? Number three is you spoke about irtidad, or people leaving the religion, not very uncommon among other faiths, but when it comes to the Islamic faith, it's something of a issue that we are facing all through the world. I'm from India, and I noticed that happening within the family as well. So I just wanted to know what measures you recommend to prevent this from happening on a very large scale. Thank you.
Very good question. The dehumanization paper became actually a reference point to many organizations, and actually it's helping reshape the definition of dehumanization. It's being used now by not only groups like Twitter and Facebook, but also national and international human rights groups that are trying to fight dehumanization online. Political parties have not responded in writing to those, but we are engaged with some political parties in Australia, having some serious discussions actually on not only social media's impact in terms of dehumanization, but also political rhetoric and the dehumanization of that of Muslims. And so one way of countering that dehumanization is to change some terminologies that the government is using when they refer to terrorism, for example. When they always give a religious motivation behind terrorism, we find that to be problematic because it lumps Muslims often in one basket. There is a big debate in Australia now about banning the ISIS flag. And the challenge with that for Muslims is that it's got the Shahada on it, and the Shahada will be used in almost every masjid. And if a person wants to use a flag that doesn't look like ISIS flag, but it has the same wordings, will they be also held accountable by the law? So these are some serious questions that we are trying to challenge the government on. And so the dehumanization paper and the work of Aman and other entities like Australian National Imams Council and so forth is trying to force the government to rethink about some of the definitions, and instead of using religiously motivated violence, to say ideologically motivated, to take the Islamic out of it, and so on. So, and I'm happy to share that paper with anyone, $20 per paper, but no, just kidding, it's for free. Yes, I'm just kidding. You know, and now regarding the irtidad, this is a massive issue, of course, and I think all institutions within an Islamic context must play a role. And this is whether it's the family inside the house, or the Islamic school, or the teacher in the school, or what is being said in the masjid, or the way we say it. When we did the largest study of we wanted to find out from young Australian Muslims who go to Islamic schools, what their experiences in studying Islam. These are well-established Islamic schools in Australia, and this is the only and the largest study that was done in the West, as far as we know. It was interviews, not surveys, with a sample of about 200 students, so that's a large sample. And we found that these young Muslims, year 10, 11, and 12, so they are young adults, they said, we love Islam, but it's what is taught and how it is being taught that is the problem. So if you look at the what and the how, and you look at inside the house, in the masjid, in the school, in the madrasa, the what and the how, and looking at what they have, we summarized, and there's some publications that we summarize their views to 5 things. This is their experience with the way Islam is being taught to them is boring, repetitive, irrelevant, out of context, and biased. Boring because it's boring, right? That's what they're telling us, right? It's like, I go to the biology class, for example, they say, and every year there's some advancing. But I go to the Islamic studies class and it's not advancing. The way it is being taught is didactic. It's not, it's very well boring. It's repetitive. What they're learning in primary, they're still learning in secondary with no higher level thinking. And in order, if you want to really equip them so they can be able to challenge atheism, for example, then do that in school. Don't shy away. Critical thinking is important in our tradition. It has always been important. And that's why some scholars today have argued that maybe we should reintroduce logic and philosophy in some of the curricula to teach them that thinking, that process of thinking. How do you think logically? How do you construct arguments logically? Because prescriptive answers to Islam are not helping. Prescriptive answers. This is halal, this is haram. You don't need to know why and what. So they say it's repetitive. In every other subject, they keep advancing. When it comes to the teaching of Islam, it's repetitive. And they say it's irrelevant. What you're teaching me is important, but it's not always relative to my life today. So now students are exposed to this challenge of AI. So what are we teaching them in the classroom about? And you will realize that not all teachers, therefore, are equipped to teach on these matters. So we need to retrain some of these teachers. And there is no shame in that. And they said it is biased, and that's important because the teacher only wants to impose his or her jurisprudential or fiqhi point of view, or their own particular madhab. And of course, I'm not advocating for la madhabiyya here. I'm not advocating for no madhab. We need a madhab. But what we need to appreciate is that students are exposed to other viewpoints. And if you, so for example, you say to a teacher, when you teach your students, I ask this question to some teachers, when you teach them about music in Islam, do you say it's halal or haram? And often the answer, it's haram. I say, are you saying that all forms of music is haram? What exactly is haram about music? Which aspect is, they said, no, it's all haram, full stop, except the deaf. So I said, all right, if your student listens to that from you, and then now they go and Google, and they find that there are other viewpoints that says, hold on, there are actually different viewpoints on this issue. And now the student comes to you again and says, excuse me, sir, but the respected scholar so-and-so says such and such about the question of music. What do you think? He says, no, I told you it's haram, and that is wrong. Or that what the view of that scholar is wrong. You know what that does? What we found this does? Immediately, it breaks that trust between the student and the teacher. And that teacher is no longer seen as a reference point for the student. And so he will no longer, or she, go to that teacher for answers. And now you are leaving them now to go and look elsewhere for answers. And that can be more dangerous, right? So the idea of bias, yes, you can say the viewpoint that I follow, the madhab that I follow says such and such, but I'd like you to also be aware that there are different valid viewpoints, because we do live in a globalized world and it's all accessible nowadays, at least in the Australian context. I'm not talking about, I'm sure in the Malaysian context may be similar. So if we are to be proactive and preempt by equipping our students, then these are important. What is taught, but the pedagogy is important, how it is taught. For example, and I know time, there is a beautiful concept in our tradition, and that is the dignified learner. If you look at the life of the Messenger of Allah, he dignified students always. The idea of humiliating a learner, humiliating a child, or is counterproductive. Is counterproductive. If you want respect from the learner, you should show respect as a teacher. There's a reciprocal relationship of respect, right? Often that is missing. There's a very harsh approach to the teaching of faith or Islam. It's a very harsh, hard, obnoxious sometimes approach that turns these young people off Islam. So in your presence, he will say, yes, I'm a Muslim. One of the latest cases, and I'll just finish with this, one imam at his Islamic school, he's a deputy principal. He said to me that this young Muslim guy, the minute he turned 18, he left Islam. And he said, his parents said, but you've been praying all this time and you've been fasting. He said, I was just doing it to make you happy, but until I was waiting for the time that I no longer need you. And so how are we teaching Islam and practicing Islam in our own houses? And how are we teaching and practicing Islam in these Islamic schools? When several Islamic schools have become elitist schools, right? And so it's a multifaceted approach to the issue of countering atheism. And all of us need to be working on this together with a very open mind and with also some level of bravery to say what the Muslims of the past said when knowledge from other civilizations came to them. They said, bring it on. We have a very strong Islamic worldview that we are well grounded, and we will take what you give us and filter it through our worldview, take what is best and leave that which does not suit us. Are we preparing students with that level of understanding? Allahu A'lam. Yes. Well, Sheikh Google is popular. Mufti Google now. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, we have a lot of valuable questions, precious questions inside chat here, but we need to end. And I may conclude, we can react, in Islam, when we practice Islam, it's not just about the external things, but also how we deal with our internals. And it's how we create balance between emotions and intellectual means. And the most important is the balance that we create between these two, because we live in a world full of colors. It's never about one color, but the combination of all colors that create the beauty of all the colors. Thank you, Australia. Thank you, Prof. Abdullah. And thank you, Australian High Commission. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Our program for today, on behalf of Istac-Iium, I would like to express our greatest appreciation to our honorable speaker for today, and to Australian High Commission, and participants who are here in Ibn Khaldun room online. We hope there is a great takeaway from this event today. And before that, we have a gift presentation, token of appreciation. First to Professor Abdullah. Okay, we take a photo together? Yeah, group photo, inshallah. First,